Adam Mills joins me this week to discuss the use of thiolized yeast. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 290. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 290, and it's mid-October 2023. Adam Mills joins me this week to discuss the use of thiolized yeast. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. And also the American Homebrewers Association. The Homebrewers Association invites you to join today and get a free bonus book. Join for 1 year and select a free brewing book for more than 60 titles. Visit homebrewersassociation.org/beersmith to join the American Homebrewers Association and treat yourself to a new brewing book. Again, that special link is homebrewersassociation.org/beersmith. And also BeerSmith Web, the online version of BeerSmith brewing software. BeerSmith for the web lets you design great beer recipes from any browser, including your tablet or phone. Edit recipes on the go with a full suite of recipe building tools as our desktop version. Try BeerSmith Web today by creating a free account at beersmithrecipes.com. And finally, a reminder to click on that like and subscribe button on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or whatever platform you're on. Clicking those buttons is a great way to support the show. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome Adam Mills, who is Director of Brewing Operations at Sonder Brewing. Adam is a former teacher who shifted to brewing professionally and runs a YouTube channel called Adam Makes Beer. Adam, it's great to have you on the show. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about what you're doing at your professional brewing career that you started.
Yeah, I ended up moving I'm not originally from the Cincinnati area. That's where I've been the last few years. A few years back, I moved my family and I here for the head brewing job over at Cartridge Brewing. And then just recently, I took over the director of brewing ops job over at Sonder. And we have a lot of new challenges over there. It's an automated system. They have some really cool stuff. So it's been a fun growth curve for me getting over there. We make a lot of German style beers and of course hazies and fruited stuff that everybody else likes. And we're a distribution brewery. We have a tap room in Mason, and then we're actually end of the month, I believe, they're going to be soft opening a new tap room in Westchester as well, also in the Cincinnati area. So exciting growing times for us at Sonder.
That's great. And were you a home brewer as well?
Yeah, I was into home brewing. I got into home brewing in the early 2000s, and when I first got into it, it was I was listening to the Brewing Network.
Yeah.
That was my big launch into stuff, and it was such a great time because I had a long commute while I was teaching. It was anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half, 2 hours, depending on weather each way. And so I was just plowing through all those Brewing Network podcasts with all those great pro brewers and home brewers on there. And so it really shortened the growth curve for me. And I got really involved in the homebrew judging and competition scene. And that was kind of what raised my exposure when a brewery wanted to open in my hometown. So.
And when did how did you decide to jump into homebrewing? What were you doing before that? I guess you were teaching high school level or something?
Yeah, I taught at-risk kids. So at the time, they were called alternative schools. So they were primarily kids that were court-ordered or expelled from their original school and just weren't successful in their original, in a traditional setting. And I did that for 10 years. It was super rewarding. Yeah, and then so I ended up transitioning from there. I left teaching after a decade and got into the professional brewing side of things.
Cool. Well, today you wanted to discuss thiolized yeast strains, and we've had a few guests on talking about some of the options for for creating these fruity beers. And of course, Stan Hieronymus has been on a couple times talking about the importance of thiols. But I wanted to hear in your own words what you think about thiolized yeast strains, and what are these things used for, and what are they actually doing when we talk about using a thiolized yeast in the brewing process?
Sure, sure. So, just kind of in a nutshell, like thiols are highly impactful aromatic compounds, and they can bring out these really intense tropical citrus. A lot of times people get like passion fruit, pink guava, grapefruit peel out of it, things like that. The thing that's interesting about these compounds is you don't need to generate a tremendous amount of them in order for them to become expressive in the beer. And when we kind of talk about these thiolized strains, a lot of times they're going to be engineered yeast strains that have the ability to biotransform these thiol precursors found in anything from malt, hops, grape-derived products, and even other thiol-rich products that we can talk about a little bit later. Early on, I think these yeasts were discussed primarily through the lens of IPA because it seems like that's always the thing that we're trying to find the next big thing for, right? Whether it be new hop variety or something like that. But I think there's broader stylistic uses for these strains, and I think they do have some interesting utility.
Well, you've been working with them for quite a while now. I believe all these things are genetically modified, aren't they? Aren't they GMOs basically?
Yeah, and so the stuff that you're going to see from Omega and Berkeley are both genetically modified, and they have a whole stable of yeast. So Omega has anything from ale yeast to lager yeast, anything, and they'll have different intensities, different capacities for unlocking these thiols. Berkeley has their Tropics line, which seems to be very much in line with what Omega is doing. I'm sure they have some of their own unique differences. I'm not sure about the specific switches being flipped there, but it's my understanding that Berkeley might be using a different pathway than what Omega is. And just recently, I found out that White Labs has kind of like a natural yeast blend. And so what they did is they trialed out a lot of different yeast, just kind of trying to see what naturally they can come up with. And they have what's called Tropic Ale, which is a blend of yeast that have a high level of beta lyase activity, which can help to push those thiols out. But yeah, traditionally, a lot of these strains, well, it's funny to say traditionally when talking genetically modified, but yeah, a lot of these strains are genetically modified, which can make them difficult for some of our brewing friends in different areas of the globe.
So it's important to note that the yeasts themselves don't generate thiols, right? They actually free thiols in the other ingredients. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the right way to put it. Yep.
So maybe we should walk through some of the things that some of the ingredients, for example. Different ingredients obviously have a big impact on the thiols that because they provide those free thiols really that generate those aromas, right?
Sure. And so from what it seems, and I've listened to quite a bit of Dr. Laura Burns from Omega. She has a lot of information out there, whether it be in print, in podcast, a lot of good stuff. Omega's done a really good job of getting information out on what they're doing with these strains. And it appears as if husked base malts appear to have sizable amounts of thiol precursor, and some more than others. As I mentioned before, Dr. Burns suggests trialing several different types of base malts. I interviewed a good friend of mine who's a brewer up at Storm Cloud Brewing in Michigan, Chris Schneff, and they have a nice little pilot system. And he essentially just made a 20 IBU blonde ale. And Just the only difference was a number of different base malts, locally grown stuff, different things like that. And he said, even though it's anecdotal, he said there's compelling differences between the different beers. He was pulling more things like some more intense pink guava on some things than others. So, that is something to look at with these strains.
I mean, have you had a chance to experiment with malts? I hadn't really heard much about malts contributing significant amount of thiols before, but it's certainly possible. I mean, thiols are a lot of plants and vegetables.
Sure. I haven't had the opportunity to play around with it on the malt side all that much because I don't really have that's kind of the ideal situation for a small batch. For small batch trials, and I don't really have that available to me. But I do know that is one of the things that they recommend with that. I do think it's funny that a lot of times these yeasts are paired up with hazy beers, and a lot of typical hazy recipes will have a lot less base malt in them comparatively. So if you think blonde ale, you can think of maybe 100% base malt beer. You know what I mean? You could have a very simple grist like that. But these hazy beers that people are making, they can have up to 20, 30, and even north of 30% of the grist be things that are huskless, whether that be wheat, oats, things like that. So
True.
Some of the things that are happening on the grist side with kind of some typical hazy builds can actually be something that ends up pulling back the reins a little bit on what might be the thiol expression in a beer like that.
That's interesting. So you're saying you get thiols primarily, I assume, from barley base malts, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So you're not getting from a lot of the adjuncts that are used in a lot of the hazies.
Correct.
Interesting. Well, obviously, hops provide the bulk of the thiols, right?
Sure.
And in fact, there's some that are much more, have a lot more, not only more thiols, but the other compounds like geraniol and so on that provide enable these biotransformations that eventually lead to these fruity flavors.
Sure.
So what hops, are generally work best with this type of thing, and when are you adding them?
Yeah, and that's kind of the exciting sell on a thiolized strain like this is we're usually looking for, depending on crop year and everything like that, people are usually looking for potentially some hops that are harder to find or potentially more expensive. And we know there's a difference between trying to buy Cascade on the spot market, or or something like Citra, Mosaic, or maybe some of the New Zealand hops, some of the more difficult to acquire hops. There's some price range differences there, and typically we attach these ideas of these big tropical notes to these more difficult to get hops. But these thiolized strains work very well with hops like Saz, Cascade, Middle Fruit, Calypso. Some things that aren't typically thought to be these big tropical bombs, right?
Well, I find that kind of interesting because a lot of the European hops have very low thiol levels to start with. In fact, it's generally been found that at least this is what Stan told me, that it's really the American hops and the American derived hops, which includes the New Zealand and Australian brands, that have these free thiols that we need to get these fruity flavors.
Sure. And there does seem to be, and this is where you can kind of get into technique and things like that. I've done beers like this where I've done really aggressive amounts of, for me, this was maybe, I believe off the top of my head, I believe it was a blend of Saz and Cascade. But there is an impact on the volume of green matter getting downstream when you're brewing these beers. And so it can lead to some what might be, kind of older school or methodologies that aren't used as much anymore when it comes to malt timing or hop timing and things like that.
So are you using these, at least what I've associated this technique mostly with adding hops either during active fermentation or dry hopping primarily, where you get, the biotransformations that happen during active fermentation, or maybe shortly after fermentation, you're doing a early dry hop addition
Sure.
with some of these hops that have the high aroma oils and the thiols in them. Is that what you're doing here, or are you doing something different?
Yeah, I mean, you can do some of that, but in a lot of ways, people will try to stack these hops into the mash, and it's a way of getting that precursor into that wort and not carrying as much green matter over into the fermenter, because there just seem to be a diminishing factor when you have green matter going into your fermenter, as far as diminishing the impact of thiols and the finished beer. I've had that happen. I've had that happen firsthand when I was running a production hazy that was going into cans, and I ended up cutting back the dry hop in that beer, and I found that that was when the thiol character actually started to step forward. Right. So that's one of the reasons that you can see some non-traditional hop timings for things like that, and potentially a good use case if you're trying to maximize thiol impact. It would be a good use case for some of the more modern advanced hop products.
So you're primarily doing hazy IPAs here, I guess, right? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yes.
so yeah, I mean, you definitely run into a number of risks. The hazy IPAs use a huge amount of dry hops typically,
Sure.
and so you run into problems like hop creep, as well as the vegetal flavors are certainly a potential, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And the nice thing is something that is a positive with these tropical thiols. They seem to have a very long shelf life. So I don't know if any of you have noticed those nice hoppy beers that you're making at home or in the brewery that you work at. They can fall off a cliff. Those hop compounds can definitely fall off from a freshness standpoint. And these tropical thiol notes tend to have some nice staying power. So some people are utilizing them to be able to cut back on some of the volume of dry hop that they're using, and have a nice shelf stable fruit component, both in on the nose and flavor.
Okay, well let's dive into mash hops for a minute. I've traditionally been not a big fan of mash hopping because of course you get really low utilization out of it, and also virtually none of the aroma oils are going to survive the boil. Right, they're going to all disappear.
Sure.
But I have read recently some of the more recent research that mash hopping does have an advantage with respect to some of these compounds that help free thiols, perhaps later. I assume it all happens much later in the process, actually.
Sure.
But I have heard of people using mash hopping again as a sort of bring back a very old technique to help enhance these fruity flavors in the beer. So can you tell us a little bit about mash hopping first, because many people may not be all that familiar with it. It's quite an old technique, and then also about how that helps when you use these thiol boosting yeasts.
Sure. So this is one of those things. So I'm one of those brewers that I probably am not going to be able to bust down everything from a scientific standpoint as finely as it can be, but I can give you like some of like the functional highlights. And so as we were talking, mash hopping is one of these areas where we can be starting to really build these where we can really start to build this thiol precursor load in your wort. Okay. And one of the nice things about the mash, so first of all, the idea is when you're mash hopping, you are hopping during the mash. So what I would do is I would get about halfway through my mashing, doughing, whatever you call it, and then I would start adding my hops to that, and you can smell those aromatics coming out of there, everything like that. And I think that's one of Mash hopping is one of those techniques, like you mentioned before, like the utilization is low. Some people swear that you get a refined aromatic out of it. But I also find that it's a little bit one of those debated wives' tale kind of areas, whether it be about brewing, home brewing, or anything like that. I think sometimes we put opinions together about something, and I'm not quite sure about it. I'm not a big mash hopper in my day-to-day brewing life. You know what I mean? But I do think there's an interesting application here because it does give that wort an opportunity to be exposed to those thiol precursors. And again, it's not the same thing as adding all those hops to the kettle, because when I'm graining out, I can see the green matter that's coming out with the grist, right? So it's a way of being able to get those thiol precursors into solution in the wort, and not be carrying that green matter downstream, which when you add too much green matter can actually counteract some of the effects of that thiol expression.
Well, I'm a little skeptical because obviously geraniol and all those other aromatics are very volatile. So they boil off, almost as soon as you start boiling. So certainly if you're doing a 60, 90-minute boil, all those are going to be gone. Now you're saying, I assume some of the, like 3MM thiol compounds actually do survive the boil somehow?
That seems to be, it does seem to be the case. So we did a beer, just a smaller wheat beer. Really, the idea behind making it was, if I was going to be using Heliogazer as my house yeast for this hazy that I was going to be making for distribution, it would be great to have a yeast grower for it. And so I was thinking, I'm originally from Michigan. And there's always room in a tap room in a pub type setting for a nice sessionable wheat beer. And so I was like, well, maybe I can use a mash hopped wheat beer as kind of my yeast propping batch to be able to continue to have new yeast for this distribution hazy IPA that I wanted to make. So we did make just kind of a typical American wheat beer, with a good amount of wheat in it, probably off the top of my head, probably 45% wheat. And the interesting thing is just mash hopping. So it was 20 IBUs in the mash. So yeah, there was a lot of hops that went in there because we were talking about the low utilization. That beer carries to me a surprising level of passion fruit with it.
Interesting.
Both on the nose and on the flavor. And now I don't think anybody would mistake it for a passion fruit wheat beer, or like a passion fruit fruit beer, right? But those notes are definitely in there, and you do get a little bit of that. A little bit of that white wine like note with it as well. So it's an interesting thing, and it does seem to carry through.
And you did that with mash hop only? You didn't add any hops later on?
Nope, just mash hop only. And so my guess is at least a portion of that would have to come for the mash hop, because almost half of that grist was wheat, which is huskless and is not supposed to contribute a lot on the precursor side. So I could see an argument of, if I had a blonde ale that was like maybe 100% base malt, maybe that was more of where that thiol note was coming from. But yeah, there does seem to be some link there.
I mean, traditionally, I've seen these thiol boosting yeast used again with hops in either during active fermentation or dry hopping. Sure. Have you tried combining that with the mash hopping? Do you get perhaps a better result? I don't know.
I've not used those two techniques together. I have done some other things, some kind of other tips and tricks that we are kind of hinting at earlier when it comes to some different type of advanced hop products. I think that there's some application there if you're trying to maximize the thiolized character in some of these beers.
Well, maybe it's a good time to go on and talk about some of the more advanced topics. Things like cryo hops, salvo. A lot of them are really lupulin powder, which
Mm-hmm.
is, I guess, the professional name for it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but let's talk about how can you use those products to enhance the flavor, either in whirlpool or dry hopping.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to that concept of removing green matter from the equation. When we're talking about, salvo, incognito, cryo
Well,
hops.
maybe good perhaps to talk about what those are. So it'd be good for folks to know. They're basically forms of lupulin powder, right? But how are they
Sure.
made?
Absolutely. So, cryo hops. I'm not sure exactly on the how they're made portion of it. It does the cryo does imply like a cold processing of some sort.
Yeah, they use.
Um,
I believe they use. Well, there's several different proprietary techniques, but the basic idea is to separate the lupulin gland from a lot of the rest of the hop, really,
sure.
and basically get it down to a material that doesn't have, as you mentioned, all the vegetal material.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the nice thing about stuff like that is it increases yield, right? When you're not introducing all that green matter to your beer. It's one of those areas when we're all trying to chase these more and more intense IPAs. The more hops we put in those beers, the more loss we have. Whether you're in a 5-gallon fermenter or a 30-barrel fermenter, you know what I mean. The more we increase that side of it, the more we lose. And whether that be for cost or just volume's sake, nobody wants to be losing beer. So there's some real advantages of using these products that do have less green matter to them, or no real green matter at all. And so you don't have to deal with that loss, as well as some of the other things where some of those products might be able to help diminish some of the hop burn characteristics that people can pull off of beers as well. So when you end up using those products in the whirlpool, especially in the whirlpool, whether you're using like the salvo, these oils, cryo hops, this is really where they start recommending you use those things. Is in the whirlpool, because it is getting those hop aromatic compounds into your wort without introducing all of the green matter.
Yeah,
The
and
same thing.
they are great because they really preserve those aroma oils that we talked about earlier that are kind of volatile and boil off really easily.
Absolutely. And there's some fun things out there that people are doing on the home and pro side. I was listening to Kelsey McNair. He's brewing out of California and making killer award-winning hazy IPAs out there at his brewery. Some of the stuff he's done is he's done some hazies where he runs a few barrels at, just before knockout, he runs a few barrels of boiling wort into the bottom of his fermenter. And that's the first time he's introducing some of these oil type compounds, right? Keeping them out of the whirlpool completely, and then, running cold wort on top of that, this, that, and the other thing. There's a lot of different ways to slice it. But big picture, if you are looking at trying to, push these thiols as far as you can, diminishing that green load of hops going into your beer late, whether that be whirlpool or dry hop, is the way to go. And you can achieve that with some of these advanced hop products.
Well, and I think it's important to note too, the thiols by themselves aren't necessarily the aroma compounds we're looking for. It's the other ones that get so linalool, geraniol, and so on that gets biotransformed, right?
Yep, absolutely.
So, I mean, adding those back in, particularly at critical points, dry hopping, whirlpool hopping, really does help enhance that fruity flavor you're looking for.
Definitely. And what I found is, and this is right around the range that I know Dr. Burns has talked about too, and it might be a little counterintuitive, but when doing hazy beers, I've dropped that whirlpool, pardon me, not whirlpool, I have dropped the dry hop closer to 1 pound per barrel as opposed to 3 to 4. And I know sometimes people go higher than that too, right? But I found that the passion fruit really jumped out on the hazy that we were making when I dropped that dry hop down to 1 pound per barrel.
Okay, and then I wanted to talk about some of the other. There's also these thiol boosting additives, things like Phantasm, I think, which is derived from grapes, I believe. Can you talk
Yeah.
about some of those products and what they do?
Yeah, definitely. Just like you mentioned, Phantasm was one of the ones that hit the market first and early on, and it was like one of these things that was super hard to get. My understanding, it's still relatively expensive, but it is the dried and powder remnant of the high thiol New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc grapes, right? And that wine is known for some of these tropical characters, right? And so they're realizing that there's these precursors still available in this powdered, dried remnant of that grape crushing process, and that's something that you can add in your beers. Typically, people are adding that at Whirlpool. You're even seeing some hops now. I know some folks are selling some. I saw some cryo mosaic that were infused with Phantasm as well. So you're seeing kind of that link together. Berkeley Yeast has what they call Thiol Boost, which is they call it a plant derived liquid thiol precursor source. And that's to be added to the fermenter kind of within 12 hours of pitch. And it does require the use of these thiolized strains. One of the things that they like to market this product as is it's a consistent uh, measured levels of thiol that you can, or thiol precursor that you can be adding to your beer. So if you are in a situation where you're very worried about repeatability, whether that be on the home side or the pro side, it's one of those things where this is a product where you can um, kind of dial in exactly how much you're using as opposed to uh, leaning on an agricultural product that may have higher or lower thiol precursors in it.
So I guess they're probably not working from grape skins. Then maybe they're doing some other kind of chemical process. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know much beyond that. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some grape skin in there, but it sounds like they might be having some other things going on as well.
And I mean, we haven't talked about this, but the wine industry has known about thiols for a long, long time and have been
Sure.
very focused on on that, right? For especially with
Yeah.
regard to certain grape strains,
Well, and
grape
Scott
varieties.
Janish has done so much work, and if anybody tuning in is not familiar with Scott Janish's work, he wrote the new IPA, which I think if you have any interest in brewing hoppy beer at all, it's just a great read, and his blog, it's I think it's kind of an undershot to call it a blog. ScottJanish.com. He has some blog posts that are really high level research research based articles and experiments that he's carried out in there. For a long time he was chasing wine yeast ale strain blends and trying to pop some of these thiol notes in his hoppy beers. So yeah, you're absolutely spot on that the wine folks have been ahead of us for a while on this.
Yes, they have. Yeah, I've had Scott on the show a number of times actually, and he's been great. We had him on not too long ago talking about dry hopping, for example.
Yeah, he's just such a. I just love the passion that he has for it, and then just the willingness just to say, "Hey, this is exactly what we're doing, and this is what we're finding." Guys like that always really inspire me.
Yeah. Well, walk us through then. You seem to be focused on hazy IPAs, for example. Walk us through a sample of hazy IPA and how you might incorporate, several of these techniques and ingredients to get the fruity flavors that you're looking for.
Sure, and I think when you're talking about hazy IPA, in my mind, a lot of these beers that I've had, they have a very specific passion fruit character. I know we mentioned, sometimes like a wine-like thing, but especially an IPA, they come through to me as explicitly passion fruit. And something we haven't quite touched on yet is we're talking about compounds that are at the very least sulfur adjacent, and so it's not like you're going to be making a beer that has a bunch of passion fruit used in it. There's this passion fruit note, and it's a little bit flat line or one dimensional. And I'm not saying that there's not a place for it and that it can't be useful. But it can be a little bit one note. And so I think it's best to try to use these thiolized strains as a wrinkle in the hazy beer that you're making. Just from me personally, and I know some other folks have also echoed that maybe try to use these strains as nuance instead of the leading character. So I think a great experiment is if you have a base IPA that you really like, just first thing, just swap this yeast in and see what it does. I think you're going to see that the heart and soul of the beer is going to be very much the same, but there's going to be a little tweak on it. You can utilize all the techniques that we've kind of talked about today to try to magnify those things. Go with more base malt, mash hopping, maybe try to cut back that dry hop load, use some of the advanced hop products. Those are all things that you can do to really magnify and make the most intense version of these that you can. But I would almost suggest just folding it into your standard IPA/hazy IPA recipe, and then just seeing if you like the nuance that it gives you. I think that big picture, I think these thiolized strains have some exciting possibilities in more of a nuanced way. I think that I have a friend right now who's making a production beer. So it goes out in cans. It's a fruit beer, and for cost reasons, it has to be a 100% extract beer. And so he leans on passion fruit for the extract for that. But he has been starting to use heliogazer in this all base malt blonde beer. And he was saying that these most recent batches of this fruit beer are the best version that he's made of it thus far, because he's now able to layer the fruit expression that he's getting from the yeast and the top note that he's getting from the extract, and it's actually making a superior beer to what he was making before.
One of the things I realized just a minute ago we neglected to cover. Can you talk about the specific yeasts that are available, and particularly some of the ones that you may have experimented with that are thiolized?
Sure. So most of all of my work with thiolized strains have been with Omega. The majority of batches that I have made have been with heliogazer, which is kind of their more aggressive, the most expressive version of their thiolized strain. It is a London 3. I'm going to say variant, but it's not really a variant. It's a London 3 derivative. It's London 3 with that genetic modification for thiol expression. And I think it's reliable. I think it's easy to use. I was using a lot of London 3 before, so on the pro scale, I knew how the yeast behaved and how easy it is to harvest and reuse. That's a yeast strain I like a lot, and so that's what we ended up going with, and that's what I've run most of my pro size batches with.
Well, how do you achieve the right balance in some of these beers? I've heard of some people going overboard and using every single possible technique at once and creating a beer that maybe isn't balanced right. How do you address target a beer that's balanced overall, whether it's hop forward or fruit forward or whatever?
Sure. And kind of like I mentioned, I didn't mention this before, but whenever I'm creating flavors in a beer, and especially like if we're thinking about adjuncts, and we're kind of hitting around this whole time really talking about fruit flavors, right? Yeah. So when I'm going to be making a fruit beer, I will typically ferment the fruit out. But I like to be able to get a nice base flavor in the beer with the real thing, and then I like to feather over the top with a little bit of TTB approved natural extract. The reason that I like to do that is it can be challenging to get the aromatic out of that beer. The flavor may be there, but sometimes the intensity of the aromatic isn't there, and it can end up letting the beer down, right? If people don't smell it as it's coming up to their mouth, it can be an issue as far as being able to perceive the intensity of that. And so I would approach the same thing with something like this. I think you want to layer up. I would recommend that if you are utilizing something like this on the fruit side, I would love to see what an actual passion fruit beer tastes like that is made with something like this, or using a strain like this to ferment the blonde ale that would go into some kind of fruit beer. Whether you're just trying to drive some tropical nuance, I think that's a great way to do it. But just kind of keep in mind the variables that are in place that can help you kind of raise and diminish the intensity. So something that we haven't really mentioned thus far is with the omega products, they have some strains that are relatively expressive, and some strains that are kind of super expressive. Helio Gazer is one of like the super expressive strains. So they have some kind of dialing up moderating factors, even just with the different strains that they offer. But yeah, I would kind of look at it like that. If you want to find the ceiling and kind of maximize everything and just make that thiol bomb, go for it. But I think it might be better to try to fold it in nuance in some of the ways that we've discussed prior.
Everybody seems to be focused on either big IPA, fruity IPAs or hazy IPAs here.
Sure.
Don't these yeasts have application perhaps to other styles of beer as well?
Definitely. I had a great, the first time I experienced this yeast strain was I was up at Noble Beast in Cleveland. They had the Ohio Craft Brewers Conference up there. And so I was in town for that. We went into Noble Beast, great spot, great beers, and they had a Thiolized light lager on. And I drank that, and that was really interesting. I think even light lagers and different things like that, there's areas where these beers can be used just to drive some nuance. Yeah, I don't know. I think I think there's some interesting use cases for it.
Finally, I wanted to talk about clarifying and filtering these beers, which can have a big impact on the final flavor, obviously. Can you talk about your experience with those?
Yeah, and so for me, what I've seen is I've used Biofine in these beers, and so sometimes Scott Janish has talked about utilizing Biofine with his hazies, and that might sound kind of counterproductive. But what the idea is that you're not necessarily dropping out all the haze. He tends to feel as if you can be dropping out some of the hop burn, maybe some of that polyphenol burn that comes into play there. And so Biofine is something that I've used in all beer styles, whether they be hazy or German lager. I have not found a tremendous impact on knocking thiols out of a beer. Like I've never had a situation where I feel as if, going into a clarification tank, a lagering tank, that I've got this big passion fruit thing going on, and then I clarify it, and on the other side, it's not there anymore. So yeah, that's been my experience with it. But however, I've also not actually done physical filtration with these either, so I couldn't speak too specifically about that.
Well, Adam, wanted to get your closing thoughts on using thiol boosting yeast, thiol boosting ingredients, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times as brewers and particularly as people that are raw material providers, we're always trying to catch lightning in a bottle and find out what the next Citra, the next Mosaic, whatever the next hot product is that's going to take over our industry. And for a while, some people were saying they thought that maybe it'd be Kvike yeast, different things like that. And there is some firepower behind this thiolized yeast thing in that same vein. And I think with all those things, probably it's best as a tool in the tool belt. It's best to understand what it does on the high end, on the low end, in the middle, and then see how we can fold it into interesting new beers. We mentioned obviously the application in hop forward beers, tropical beers, but you can also be doing that to make more nuanced fruit beers. You can be putting it into and even thinking about other yeast strains that are fruit forward. I think there might be some interesting options with some Belgian strains. There's some Belgian strains that produce a real white fruit note, whether that be pear, apple, things like that. Folding in some light tropical note into things like that, I think has some interesting possibilities as well. So thinking about your expressive yeast strains, and then blending those in. I know I have friends that are using blends of both thiolized yeast and Kvike strains. So there's different ways to dial that up and down. And no, I don't think it's something that is the next rocket ship thing that's going to the moon as the must use thing in craft beer or home brewing. But I do think that it can be a useful tool, and I think it's good to be able to wrap your head around it and try to find areas with which you can kind of color outside the lines with it.
Well, Adam, really appreciate you coming on the show today. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. I appreciate the time.
Today, my guest was Adam Mills. He's Director of Brewing Operations at Sonder Brewing. Thanks again, Adam.
Thank you.
A big thank you to Adam Mills for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. And also the American Homebrewers Association. The Homebrewers Association invites you to join today and get a free brewing book. Join for 1 year and select a free brewing book for more than 60 titles to match your fermentation goals. Visit homebrewersassociation.org/BeerSmith to join the American Homebrewers Association and treat yourself to a new brewing book. And BeerSmith Web, the online version of BeerSmith brewing software. BeerSmith for the web lets you design great beer recipes from any browser, including your tablet or phone. Edit recipes on the go with the same full suite of recipe building tools as our desktop version. Try BeerSmith Web today by setting up a free account at beersmithrecipes.com. And finally, a reminder to click on that like and subscribe button on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or whatever platform you're on. Clicking those buttons is a great way to support the show. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.